So it gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's session and also to thank the organisers of this symposium, the Learned Society of Wales. Thank you for organising this wealth and richness of sessions, and I'm sure that this evening will add an exciting dimension for you as we discuss our subject, which is language and refuge. So I will now welcome the panel. I'm Gwenan. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Welsh in Swansea University, and I look at language and immigration and looking at citizenship and the Welsh language. But this evening, of course, we have different voices representing Wales, Scotland and beyond. 4 of them are research students, so 2 from Glasgow University. We have 2 from Swansea University, Sarah and Joseph Anabo. They are all undertaking research and the links between language, immigration, asylum, a feeling of belonging, and some of them have had direct experience having to flee countries and having to establish themselves either in Wales or Scotland. But before then, I'd like to turn to the Professor Alison Phipps to open our discussions this evening. She's a Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies and a Chair of UNESCO on integrating refugees through languages and the arts. She is also a poet and a journalist for the newspaper The National. And for me personally, she's an inspirational figure on a professional and a personal level, if I may say. I've had a result of the Home Office's hostile environment through my recent experiences of my husband seeking asylum in Britain, and Alison's essays, poems and articles have been a comfort and provided hope during quite a difficult time. And Alison has also published a volume on decolonising multilingualism, which I think will be the basis of our discussions this evening. So enough from me. So Alison, thank you for being here this evening.
You to start the discussion.
Thank you so much, Gwenan. It's lovely to be with you all, and particularly grateful to the Learned Society of Wales for the invitation. I'm delighted that at long last we've been able to come, but also that these times of the restrictions and pandemics have also opened up a world of Zoom, which means that we can just hop on our Zoom sticks so much more easily than when we actually have to use visas and visa applications to cross international borders or take the West Coast main line all the way down to try and join you in Wales. And absolutely delighted also that we've been able to bring the Sarah and Joseph and Hiab and Sarah along to really give of their insights, because they have that wonderful luxury at the moment, although they may not feel like it, of having time to actually do real research once again. So it's lovely for me to be here and to have a chance to talk about this little book. It's a little book called Decolonising Multilingualism, Struggles to Decreate. And it's one of those books that was, I was actually lucky for once in my life that a book was published when a topic was in vogue, rather than being published either a long time after or a long time before. And just as this was coming out, there was a real renewed interest in the theme of decolonising, but also real interest in the work of languages and multilingualism, coming off the back of a number of projects that I know you've also been focusing on at the Learned Society of Wales through these 2 feast days that you have of scholarship. I maybe want to say a few things, just a little about the book and the structure of the book and what I was attempting to do with it. First of all, it was really a response to my publishers, Multilingual Matters, who are based in Bristol, and who are really a family firm, but a multilingual firm. They kicked off the scholarship on languages with people like Colin Baker, and particularly looking over the Bristol Channel into Wales for scholarship on raising children bilingually and on multilingual scholarship. So very much their understanding of their work as publishers was drawn from the multilingual experiences occurring within Wales. The need to protect languages, the need to nurture languages in children, the need to nurture bilingualism and multilingualism, the need to understand the way in which languages are connected deeply to ecological models of linguistics and of inhabitation, that we inhabit languages. Dichterisch wohnt der Mensch is a quotation from Martin Heidegger. Poetically, the human dwells. Or if you think of Champmoiseau, the great poet and thinker of post-colonialism and decolonizing, he once said, "J'écris parmi toutes les langues du monde." I write amongst all of the languages of the world. I've just come off doing the inaugural keynote lecture for Hiab, my postgraduate student, and Tesfalam from Leeds University, who are leading a refugee scholars-led network on decolonizing forced migration scholarship. And there I was just talking about being surrounded in this room by my ancestors, and by many different languages in the scholarship that is here, that is in the books on the shelves. And I think I was really wanting with this little book to do a bit of honouring of those who have gone before, those great scholars like Champmoiseau, like Fanon, like Linda Tuiwa-Smith, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, like Wole Soyinka, the great thinkers of decolonialism from the 1970s and 1980s. And to take again seriously, but also listen in to the ways in which their words reverberate, largely through English and French, but also the consequences of decisions they took. For example, Ngugi wa Thiong'o deciding not to publish any longer in English, and what's happened as a result of that as we try and decolonize languages, but also as we try and understand what decolonizing languages and multilingualism might look like within the context of the United Kingdom. And I began this work with a great deal of arrogance. And I remember being both invited to do work in the detention centre in Glasgow, Dungavel, to go up and translate and befriend those who were living in the detention centre at the time, and thinking, oh, well, I'm a linguist, you know, I do French and German, I can help. And obviously going and visiting and discovering that my fluency in way too many colonial languages was utterly useless to me. The languages that I needed to speak to do any kind of befriending and be any kind of use to anybody in those contexts were Arabic, were Tigrinya, were Pashto, were Kiswahili, were Ga and Ewe. They were not the languages that I was taught when I grew up in rough comprehensive school in South Yorkshire during the 1980s. The decisions taken about the languages that I should learn formally as part of my education were that we needed our children to learn the languages of Europe, of the Entente Cordiale, and largely French and German. And in one or two schools in what was then the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire, a few pupils, and these were very much the elite schools, were also allowed to learn Russian because it was the height of the Cold War and languages of security were important. So as I was really engaging with the scholarship, particularly of Ngugi wa Thiong'o in decolonizing the mind, I was really struck by the work that he had done with the arts in particular and theatre as the place where he found decolonizing was easiest, where the body was fully in play, where people were learning to learn new scripts, sing new words, and it was possible for them to do this, particularly as part of a collective. And I began to just reflect on how hard I had found it and how many times I had failed to learn the language of my foster daughter, who was an unaccompanied minor and who came to the UK and joined our household and our family aged 16 with very little English herself. and that me trying to learn Tigrinya was well nigh impossible for various reasons, some of which were to do with the availability of resources. There was barely anything at that point 10 years ago that I could actually move to. There was one short grammar published by the Red Sea Press in Asmara, but that was pretty much it. And it was really difficult to translate. I was really having to translate it back from grammar translation methods, really quite a terrifying way of trying to learn a language. And there was also then that lovely barrier erected by teenagers who really don't want you to understand their secret language and to go into their world. So there was a real resistance within our relationship to me learning Tigrinya, when particularly my daughter was wanting to learn English and speak it as fluently as possible and as quickly as possible. So my desire to decolonize, to undo some of my own fluency in way too many colonial languages, kept meeting with lots and lots and lots of different resistances. So I wrote the book about what it felt like to be in a situation where what was supposedly my competence, my expertise, and my professional standing as a linguist, someone who could speak about languages, who could teach languages, and who had that role within a university, who had it in the title of her personal professorship, and then also in the UNESCO chair that I hold, what it would mean to actually admit to complete incompetence in the languages that really I needed to be able to speak as part of my day job, as part of working with other people from around the world, and to actually admit that colonialism had in no way equipped me for working in the world, and to think really seriously with those many quotations that we can pull up from Wole Soyinka, who talks about, Western epistemology being a bit like how does he put it? A bit like a suburban train that keeps stopping at different stations, picking up more and more and more baggage of agency and subjectivity and discourse and all these different words that we load ourselves up with, that we then use until we derail when we come to constructivism and realize that the world is not actually as we thought it should be. Or thinking of the words of Gayatri Spivak, who said, globalization takes place only in data and capital. All else is damage control. And thinking about the ways in which we see languages die and struggle to revive themselves around us. Skutnab Kangas speaks about linguistic genocide. Others will talk about linguistic imperialism in the work of Philipson. Others will speak of language death. And that all of these metaphors are really indictments of what the dominance of the English language has meant overseas in colonized contexts. What it's meant as a result of the circulation of capital and data under globalization, but in particular what it's meant within our own isles. And as I've seen within the Scottish context, the Gaelic Language Bill was the bill that was passed in 2005, I think it was, by the Scottish Parliament, which then brought Gaelic in as an official language of Scotland, alongside Scots, alongside Doric. And then importantly was enhanced by the use of sign language, also as an official language, so that we began to see a decolonising and a revitalisation effort taken by governments, as well as by language activists and artists who had long been the people who were the stewards and custodians of the Gaelic language, of the Scots language, through Burns suppers or Celtic Connections festivals. And this has been really helpful to us, I think, within New Scots, the refugee integration strategy for Scotland, because it's already given us a starting point of multilingualism, for also saying integration is a multilateral process, and multilingual strategies for integration are important for thinking about not just making people already greatly burdened by the work of integration learn yet another skill, but actually to say, maybe this is a provocation to those of us who are within the host society to look at the languages that we've colonised with and to begin to do some work, some gentle work, some humble work of learning other languages, Tigrinya, Arabic, Gaelic. These just might be a starting point for our work. So Decolonising Multilingualism is really quite an autoethnographic book, and it talks about my struggles to decreate and my struggles with decolonisation It's quite a raw book. It doesn't do lots of interviewing of refugees about their experiences, because I really do not feel it is my place to ask those questions any longer. I think there's an ethical difficulty around that I certainly feel within my position, but rather it talks about what happened when I lost my language, when I was in too much pain to be able to speak and needed to place myself in the hands of someone who was an Ewe speaker, but who could bring me relief and healing. What happened to me when I met my daughter's family for the first time, and they welcomed me, and life took place in Tigrinya and in Bilen and in Arabic, and I could only get the gist, but the gist was enough to understand love as a language. And what happened to me when I worked with my colleague Picky Diamond in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to really start to think about decolonisation under the treaty in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also what it would mean for me to begin to be invited to adopt some practices that would enable me to inhabit a multilingual space that was translanguaged in many ways and forms. So I think I'll leave it there. That's probably enough of a provocation for you, and certainly a good opportunity for us to bring in the many panelists who've joined us, with Sarah and Joseph and Hiab and Sarah and you, Gwenham.
Yeah, diolch. Thank you, Alison. And yes, I would recommend purchasing this copy for yourselves. And I've been thinking on that theme. As you said, this is a discussion, so you're free to interrupt me. Ond dwi'n credu nawn ni barhau gyda'r
But I
sgwrs.
think we will continue with the discussion, and we'll turn to Hiab and Sarah. I'm not sure which one of you wants to go first, but perhaps you may have a reflection on what you've just heard Alison saying, and say something about your research and how these questions actually intertwine with your research.
Shall I go next? I think maybe my
Sarah, I think if you want to go next.
Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so I'm Sarah, and I'm in the final year of my PhD, final month perhaps even, at Glasgow University. And my research explores an ecological and multilingual approach to language learning. And I think what Alison's just been talking about, the concepts of decolonising multilingualism, linguistic hospitality, and linguistic incompetence, really resonate with me because they were really central to my own research. So my research is a collaborative research project, and I've been working with a group of women who've come to Scotland through the British Red Cross Family Reunion Integration Service. And my fieldwork was a teaching study to explore an ecological multilingual approach to language learning within the very specific context of New Scots within their first few weeks in Scotland, which is such a tentative time when everything is just completely new. So my work was based on the principles of language ecology, the interconnectedness between language and place, and also the interaction between languages and the mind. So it considered the internal perspective of linguistic repertoire, but also the external perspective of how language really connects to context. So all the participants I worked with were just at the very beginning of learning English. And also, as I said, they're within their very first couple of weeks of being in Scotland. And the work that we did together really drew on the principles of translanguaging, which enabled learners to move fluidly between their languages to complete tasks rather than focusing solely on English. Because I was working with an intergenerational group, it also meant that people could work with their family members in their own languages. So I think having this translanguaging, this decolonising approach, it really served the purpose of, we looked at having a decolonising approach really in terms of the research methodology, but also in terms of decolonising multilingualism, because English wasn't centre stage. It was all about the learning of each other's languages, mutual integration and mutual language learning. So we had a commitment to really bringing the participants' own languages into the teaching study as a recognised part of our teaching and learning. But as I said, it wasn't as a fixed kind of pedagogy. It was more of a stance, a disposition, a translanguaging stance, translanguaging disposition, and really just an openness to really giving that position of participants' own languages that space within our work. So for me, I'm not some kind of linguistic genius. I'm not fluent in every language, which meant I had to participate as a learner. I became a learner of Tigrinya, of Tamil, Farsi, and Arabic, and the participants really became my teachers. So it really helped to shift the balance of power in terms of how we work together as well. So I think in terms of the findings, they're kind of organised into two different categories in my mind. Firstly, the practical benefits of what that looked like in terms of pedagogy and whether it worked well. The participants told me that it really helped them to build their confidence. It really helped them with accuracy because they were able to switch back and forth between languages and to know exactly what the word meant in their own language. And it also helped to connect to the way that they use language outside the classroom in the real world. I think within language teaching in general, we're quite stuck on this idea of languages needing to be separated in terms of learning. But we know that that's not how people use language in the real world. But for me, and to come back to what Alison was saying, I think the thing that really struck me is the impact of using this approach actually beyond pedagogy. Because by using this approach, by taking this translanguaging stance, the findings showed that the positive impact of doing this went far beyond pedagogy. Because by participating as a learner, by showing my own linguistic incompetence, which I was showing on a regular basis, not just the fact that I didn't know the languages, but also I couldn't learn them quickly enough. So my learners spoke Tigrinya, Tamil and Farsi, and particularly with Tamil, I found it almost impossible to grasp very much at all. Alison's laughing because I've written about this so much in my thesis, but it showed them as really an example of how it is to learn a language and how difficult it is and how much repetition it takes. So by participating as a learner and through my own linguistic incompetence, this really provided symmetry between me as a learner of Tigrinya and their own experiences of learning English. And what struck me, I think one of the key findings for me was one of the participants told me that she could see that my struggling with Tigrinya was just the same as her struggling with English. And for me, that's really what's at the heart of the linguistic hospitality that Alison was talking about. It's part of the mutual language learning, the two-way integration, which is embedded within the New Scots strategy. And the participants also told me they felt empowered to learn because I was able to teach them in their language. And again, I felt they were being very generous by saying that I was able to teach them in their own languages because I really wasn't. It wasn't as if I could provide complex explanations in Tigrinya, Tamil and Farsi. But I thought it was really interesting that was their perception of it, that I was able to teach them in their own languages just because I was able to incorporate a few words and phrases here and there by preparing ahead of each meeting, by checking using the computer, but also crucially relying on them to actually tell me if I had it right.
Thanks, Sarah. I think there's also something quite beautiful that you were able to do as part of the work. So every year we have an annual spring school in Glasgow from the UNESCO chair. And one of the things that Sarah was able to do was invite people who'd really only been in the city for about 6 weeks. Sarah, would that be right?
They arrived I met them in February. So by the time we did the spring school, they'd been here about 2 months, nearly 3.
And Sarah enabled them to teach a session at the spring school in their language, in the different languages, and to do it really using, games and post-it notes and workshops and tables, but for everybody who was there from whatever linguistic background to kind of gain a different understanding and approach. And I think we were both really struck by how the ability of people who've literally just arrived in the city, maybe within the last 2 months, to then say, I was at the University of Glasgow teaching people who were part of the UNESCO programme my language was a very, the word empowering gets overused, but it was a very empowering thing to do in a nurturing context that Sarah had managed to create for the work. Yeah, I'm wondering if we might come to you, and just as I'm sort of introducing you, because you can speak from a very different perspective, and you might even want to tell us just all the different languages that you speak, but also what you do with your languages on a daily basis, the different ways in which you work with them and conduct scholarship with them.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Alison. Thank you for inviting me as well. Yeah, let me briefly tell you about my story first, which captures some of the things that I wanted to talk. And it's briefly, I am an Eritrean original, as you all know, and I left Eritrea like almost 10 years ago. I have been in Sudan as a refugee, as a registered refugee, kind of asylum seeker, even not recognized refugee, for about a year and a few months. And then I was kidnapped by human traffickers and ended up in Egypt, where I stayed or lived for about 3 years. And then I came to the UK under the UK Gateway Protection Programs. And my research basically is about a kind of a reflection of what happened, not just to me, but the people that I met on my way from Eritrea to here, to the UK or elsewhere in Europe, or it could be in America or Canada, or all these places. And the topic of my research is basically about the plight of Eritrean refugees in a carceral age. That's the title of the research. And I started by asking very basic questions like, why do Eritreans flee their country? How do refugees treated before or during and even after their flight? How do state and non-state actors respond to their flight or to their needs? What is the status of a refugee in modern political life? These are the basic questions that I had since I left Eritrea, since when I was in Sudan, since when I was working for UNHCR and other local charities in Egypt. These are some of the questions that I have, and that's why I'm still trying to answer through my research. And my research is also about trying to understand what it means to live at the thresholds, or even sometimes outside of the scope of the law, outside of the scope of the justice system, when you don't have when you don't have any right, when you're completely rendered as rightless by the status that you enter. How do you navigate that? How do you live in that situation? I also try to look at the limits posed by law and policy itself as well in the human conditions of those people. What kind of limitations are there because of the current politics or the law itself, which tries, particularly when it comes to refugee law that I studied very well and worked for, it tries to extract the human suffering, the vulnerable side of the refugee, rather than trying to protect them. So if you wanted to be granted as a refugee, you have to perform a victimhood. You have to tell the worst fears that you have, the worst things that happen to you, and you would never say even a word about what capabilities, what experiences, other good experiences you have. And these are the things that I struggle with as well. And when it comes to language, as I was very inspired by Alison's talk as well earlier. And English, I'm right now struggling to speak English in front of you, which is on the one hand a symbol of domination, colonization, and even human suffering to my ancestors. And on the other hand, it's a sanctuary for critical thinking, as well as the openness opportunities for people like me. This is always the dichotomy that I have. And another thing is, but let me say this as well, I also sometimes find the linguistic solace in being a multilingual. I speak like 5 languages, and English is almost the 5th language. I speak like other four languages better than I do with English. So that also helps me understand and explain situations with other languages. And multilingualism is for me like a kind of a way of life of being a social being in a highly interconnected world I'm talking to different people from different backgrounds with different languages, and it's really helpful. It has been really helpful for me to understand things from different perspectives, because I speak all these 5 languages, and they were really helpful. And in reflection to Alison's suggestion as well, Alison was talking about this idea of the struggle to create. But for me, for people like myself, it's the struggle to recreate or recover what's left from our own languages, or to tell our stories. It's also to tell or recover our cultures, our languages from the brink of the extinction. And there is also part of like the struggle to recreate our own history as well. So these are my basic reflections for now.
Thanks, Hiab. I'm going to pass over to Gwen in a moment, but just wanted to say, first of all, Hiab, you and I are definitely going to write an article around struggles to recreate at some point. But also just to congratulate Hiab, the news has just literally gone live in the last hour that Hiab's been elected as a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh on their Young Academicians programme. And it just feels really appropriate that the first thing he's doing since this news went public is with our sister society at the Learned Society of Wales. So just wanted to make sure that I say congratulations publicly to Hiab during this event. Gwennon, maybe if I can pass back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Thank you, Hiab. Thank you, Sarah. Mewn gwirionedd, roeddwn ni'n teimlo...
So, yes, I felt similar to Alison, having experience of doing a lot with asylum seekers, and as someone who's learnt a number of European languages, I felt a little bit of pride in that, and I think that I am a cultured person, and I'm able to understand different cultures, and I actually realized that this wasn't really of use to me in trying to learn about the experiences and the pain that asylum seekers were going through. So I do hope from the research that I'm doing that I am giving immigrants a voice to be able to speak for themselves. So I am extremely glad, and I know that Sarah is also here and Hiab, and it's excellent to hear about Hiab and Sarah. And just I'd like to make some points before I turn to Joseph and Sarah. One thing that struck me when we discuss devolved circumstances here in Wales and Scotland and discussing the New Scot strategy, and we are aware that that's part of the Scottish Government. And of course, we have devolved policies here in Wales as well. And when it comes to looking at asylum seekers, and also when we're looking at social cohesion as well. And more recently, we have a strategy to create Wales as a nation of sanctuary, which is extremely ambitious. And it's possible that we could question what that is actually able to achieve. And of course, there are links between Scotland and Wales when it comes to immigration. And also when we look at the Westminster government with regards to who's coming into the country. But one point which did strike me is that power, these governments do have the powers. And it's obvious from what's happening in Scotland that some specific steps are being taken, especially when we discuss languages and multilingualism and bilingualism. I don't know whether this is true, but the feeling that I'm getting is that there's greater focus on multilingualism in Scotland more so than in Wales, especially with regards to its policies. And perhaps there's greater emphasis on Welsh in Wales. But why don't we discuss more about multilingualism? And not necessarily European multilingualism, but more Eastern states and multilingualism from the immigrants themselves. And I do believe that is an area of work that could be developed far more, and specifically this concept and this idea of linguistic hospitality. I think that Alison has certainly made me think a little bit more about our function as a welcoming community here in Wales. How can we actually address these people? And of course, language is a very powerful tool. And I think that Sarah, Hiab, and Joseph shows that it is possible to be done. You don't have to insist that immigrants learn our languages, including the Welsh language here, of course. And that in itself is an interesting discussion. So yes, how? And I think you've shown us that it is possible. We are able to learn these languages, but we have to make that undertaking as easy as possible. And I think that's one of the problems. We need to become learners ourselves. And there are some important lessons for us here in Wales. There has been mention of the new curriculum. that's being introduced before long here in Wales. And how can we promote multilingualism? Well, I think that this is a good starting point. What about taking advantage of the languages that immigrants bring into this country? But of course, there's a strategy of going about doing that. It's not an easy process. But we have to accept the people, we have to respect who they are, and we need to try and understand them. And not just rhetorically, but we have to do it on a practical level. So I've just mentioned some points that have just come to mind, and my research looks at the Welsh language. And what I find interesting, even though Wales is bilingual, the Welsh Government policies focus on promoting English for immigrants. I know that there have been developments and some exciting developments to hear that there are initiatives in order to teach Welsh to immigrants, and I'm sure that Joseph can talk a little bit more about that. But we're only just beginning on this work. We're only just starting. So yes, what is the next step? Certainly the situation with regards to English and Welsh, they are not equal. There is no provision with regards to Welsh for immigrants as there is for English. But the question, I don't want to see a Welsh provision similar to the English provision. I think there's an opportunity for us to develop a Welsh provision which respects everyone's language and to try and address and to teach people through the medium of those languages. So in my opinion, the Welsh provision for immigrants in future could be a way of trying to address this idea of being hospitable when it comes to teaching languages, rather than emulating the ISOL provision. Perhaps you may have some comments to make on this. And that's the challenge. And there has been mention, say, for example, in Quebec, they promote the French. And there are plenty of interesting and powerful examples in Quebec. And perhaps they are missing something there because they do focus just on one language. And having undertaken some interviews with immigrants into Quebec, they felt that there wasn't enough respect given to their languages when they were learning French. And of course, they weren't always considering English. So lots of things for us to mull over. So I wonder, before I go on any longer, what about turning to Joseph? If you're ready, Joseph, to tell us a little bit about your experiences. An incredible experience as someone who is an asylum seeker and who has learnt Welsh and established themselves here in Wales. And it's interesting to hear about your experiences. And also you've done some research in this field. So you are now welcomed to explain a little bit more for us about these matters. So I'm Joseph. I originally come from the Ivory Coast. I left the Ivory Coast in 2011 because of war between the government and the rebellion. So the rebels actually won the war, and they were helped by the French army and also by the USA. So that's another story of colonization. But I left the Ivory Coast and I went to Ivrakum, where I stayed for a number of years, and then I had an opportunity to come to the UK. The Home Office moved me to Wales. I didn't know very much about Wales, and it was a totally new place for me. lived in Wales was to learn the language, because it's normal for me to speak the language of the country that I was living in. And it is a way of standing up against colonization, showing respect for the culture and the language and the people who welcomed me. So I began learning Welsh. And with regards to my experience here in Wales, the first thing I noticed was that Welsh has facilitated my integration into the Welsh community. And I found my first job and that first post, and it's with the Welsh Language Society. Cymdeithas yr Iaith. It's a very important association when it comes to promoting the Welsh language. Also, the Welsh language. Well, during the time when I attended the Welsh lessons or the courses, I had an opportunity to visit various places in Wales. And I had an opportunity to look at Welsh culture and the history of Wales. And I was given a social network and a network and also an academic network. I've received help and support from right across Wales, because I feel that I've integrated into the community of Welsh speakers because I speak Welsh. So those are the advantages. And so the language has allowed me to help the refugee community. And when I've worked with Cymdeithas yr Iaith, the Welsh Language Association, I've created a partnership with other organisations, including the Wales Refugee Council, Welsh for Adults, Say Something in Welsh, to providing Welsh lessons for refugees and asylum seekers and offering those opportunities for free. So that's the contribution I'm able to make because I'm able to speak Welsh. So yes, I've been given a greater voice because I'm able to speak Welsh. I've been given that voice. I give presentations within various media, the BBC, S4C, etc. And so I am not trying to say that I'm famous, but that lots of people know who I am. So it's a way of integrating. It's a way of contributing. And I'm sure if refugees have an opportunity to learn Welsh, then they will contribute more to society. There will then be lots of things that will derive from learning the language. They may be able to get, or they will have more opportunities to be able to find a job, more opportunities to be able to contribute, etc. So I do think that learning Welsh or learning the language of a country is something that's extremely important. So with regards to some of the points that Gwenan raised, I do think that there is a challenge. There will be a big challenge, I believe, because multilingualism here in Wales, I think it is an idea. It's an excellent concept. Because language is a skill, and it's an important skill. So I believe that multilingualism for Wales would be an excellent advantage for society here. So if I have an opportunity, and when I have an opportunity, because when I work with Cymdeithas yr Iaith, the Language Society, then we encourage the government to give people an opportunity to learn the language, to learn the Welsh language. When I arrived here, when I noticed that refugees and asylum seekers, they don't necessarily have an opportunity to hear very much about the Welsh language. They just hear about English. And I think that's the problem. They miss an opportunity, I think, to be able to contribute more than what they are currently doing at the moment. So that's what I think. And my linguistic experience, it's happened very, very quickly because I have been given help and support. And I think that's an important point. I speak Welsh now because I've been given help and support. I've learned Welsh and I was given that opportunity for free. And I think that's to do with political will, to decide to give everyone an opportunity to learn Welsh. Yes, so that's what I'd like to say. Thank you, Joseph. Certainly you are an ambassador for us. And one important point, certainly when I began doing my research, there were no opportunities for immigrants to learn Welsh. And you wouldn't have had that opportunity then. So the developments over recent years has meant and permitted people such as yourself to learn the Welsh language. And I'm sure that there are other similar examples. So we'll now turn to Sarah, if I may, who is also a research student with us here in Swansea and who's begun doing some very exciting work, once again on immigrants and asylum seekers and Welsh and the Welsh language. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your research and your comments on this issue. So hi, my name is Sarah and I study in Swansea. I moved to Wales from London and I learned Welsh in primary school. So my research work is
about the experiences and stories of asylum-seeking women who are resettling in Wales, so resettling in Cymru, and the kind of predominant focus is on especially women who are either mothers or expecting children or see themselves having children in the future, and who are resettling in local authorities in the dispersal communities in Wales, particularly Wrexham, Gwynedd and Casnewydd. And I hope to kind of look at the link between the experiences and perspectives of Welshness, perceptions of language, the linguistic ideologies of the women and their kind of constructions of identities and like their intersectionalized experience of Welshness, and how this may or maybe may not intersect and infer language community connection, differentiation or exclusion with Welsh language communities. My decision to focus predominantly on women was, especially women with children, was that children quite often can offer their mums a window into society. So they kind of give them a key to society in a sense that through school and through acting as interpreters. I worked in a women's centre in Birmingham, and one of the children, she was 5 and kind of interpreted for her mum in the centre. And how, especially in Wales as well, in the Welsh context, for English in-migrants, school offers a gateway to things like the Eisteddfod and to knowledge about Welsh history, Welsh community. So I think looking at women and looking at the kind of experiences of women and their children, especially in Wales, which is quite underexplored, can kind of offer us an understanding into how the nation of sanctuary policy has been implemented at ground level. Women who are refugees or asylum seekers have obviously very intersectionalised experiences, very different to men who are forced migrants. Not only do they circulate in the global economy very differently to men, sometimes as wives, as mothers, but they also are independent agents of migration. They make these decisions, and they also need kind of support when they get here. They need a different type of support. And in Wales especially, there isn't much qualitative or quantitative statistics on the experiences of refugee women. Even in the UK in general, the only kind of information that we know is that the hostile policy, how much people get to live on £39.63 a week. There's no upper time limit on detention. There's institutionalised racism that obviously refugee and asylum-seeking women are likely to face. We know that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than their white counterpart. So when you intersect that further with socio-political status, things like that, we kind of need to uncover, if we are going to implement the nation of sanctuary policy adequately in a way that deconstructs these experiences, because bringing these violences to the surface isn't enough if we aren't going to dismantle what's underneath them and what's creating these kind of systems of oppression. So I suppose how the Welsh language would work in that is it would offer kind of community classes, prenatal classes. Women would be able to connect with community members, with fellow women who are mothers, who are in kind of Welsh language stronghold areas, so the Fro Gymraeg kind of areas, and how these kind of situations, how they all impact the experiences of Welsh and Welshness, and how the nation of sanctuary policy will work properly and kind of adequately to support women. I think also my research is going to look also at COVID-19 and the impact of COVID on kind of, the fact that with the current situation with COVID, that women and just refugees and asylum seekers in general, not just women, don't have access to universal credit, local authority housing, things like that. So how is the COVID-19 situation impacting women, and how are the systems that we are putting in place to kind of offer refuge, how these working in conjunction with what's happening with coronavirus? So I wanted to share some slides of photos. So if I'll just share my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Can you see my screen okay? Yep, okay. So this is the kind of photos that I've been taking so far of the experience of COVID-19 and what is happening in Wales in particular, and how this might kind of impact the refugee and asylum seeking community, especially the refugee and asylum seeking, the women who are seeking asylum. So there's lots of these kind of situations that are popping up. So there's a kind of a community presence in Wales at the moment where things like Indifastro, Lloches, and things like that. So there's a sense of unification under the NHS, and this whole idea that, as everybody's kind of probably experienced with the clapping, how this is coming out at community level, and what this would mean seeing this, and what kind of local discourses this is creating. So the next picture is, along with signs of kind of love and hospitality and signs of NHS and things like that, there's lots of signs that are also coming up particularly in Gwynedd, which is where these have been taken. And Gwynedd is also an area that has a historical tension with English immigrants, so with things like llosgi tai haf and things like that. So these signs came up: Wales is closed, schools are closed, Wales is closed, please go home. So what is this tension? Whose home is closed? Who has the kind of authentic claim to this area? And then this sign as well, which I thought was particularly interesting, mostly because there's the camera there as well. So it was kind of a sense of like community securitization and sense of belonging, sense of kind of who owns this area, who's acceptably able to be here, and what does this mean? If I was a refugee or asylum seeker and saw that sign, how would that would I feel a sense of belonging to this place? How would that impact that? And then there's also signs that contrast with that further. So support refugees, drop-off point here. These are all in the same community in Gwynedd. So all very close to each other. So there's kind of tensions, lots of tensions going on, which is, yeah. And then this final photo, which was taken a few years ago, which is kind of why I've started this kind of research, was I was working in Calais, and there's lots of signs everywhere like wishing people luck on their journey. So although there's, alongside the police brutality, there were signs of community kind of well wishes, community acceptance and community encouragement. So that's what I'm interested in, is that what's happening at community level, what's happening, how is it creating divide, welcoming, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that is so far the kind of research that I'm doing. It's at the very beginning, so hopefully I'll have kind of more information shortly.
Diolch. Diolch yn fawr, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Just checking, we don't have much time left. I wonder, Alison, if you would like to wrap things up. We did have a few ideas for the end. Bearing in mind, I don't think anybody's asked questions so far, if I'm right. We do have a little bit of time after, but maybe we can just wrap up some of the thoughts we've discussed, and anything else you'd like to introduce.
Yeah, thanks, Gwennon. And I can just see Sarah and Joseph and Hiab in a room together, talking till midnight, because the connections between the experiences in Wales and in Scotland are so rich, but also different as well. I think I'm fascinated by what you were saying, Gwennon, about the focus on Welsh and the Welsh-English bilingualism, the unequal power structures, and that in many ways the Gaelic community are just really waking up to this and wondering about this. And I was just remembering speaking at an event last year on Gaelic, where there was a lot of kind of, I suppose, introspection and misery about the state of the Gaelic language, and no one has suffered like we have suffered. And in the end, I was saying, look, I know an awful lot of communities in Glasgow who come from language backgrounds that are utterly marginalised, where there are no materials at all. It's very, very difficult to do it, but are still able to raise their children multilingually, are still able to celebrate their cultures, are still able to contribute to the Solas Festival, to Celtic Connections Festival, to the Bemis Festival, to the Refugee Festival, to the Edinburgh Festival, to be part of the cultural life of the country, without spending their whole time saying, look, we're having a really bad time. So I think there's something actually about the relative nature of where languages find themselves, and actually being able to look out after an awful lot of very necessary inward work. So I think that would be the first strand I would maybe tease out. And I think one of the things that we've got with a multilingual strategy that had Gaelic and Scots and sign language, and then the multilingual elements to it within Scotland, has been an ability to have more starting points, rather than thinking it's either Welsh or another language and English. It's thinking, well, actually, it's Gaelic, it's Scots, it's Doric, it's sign language. And some of the ESOL work, I know, I mean, Sarah, you're involved in this as well, but some of the ESOL work has also made sure that there's a focus, even if it's just around cultural events, on particularly the Scots language. The national bard, Robert Burns. I speak every January at the Afghan Burns Summer, at the Burns Summer for the Nigerian Engineering Society. I will speak at various events around Burns Night. And I think these are really good starting points within culture and cultural work to expand the scope of what we might do and how we might look at languages. But also, so really seeing some connections there, lots of connections between Joseph, your work going inward into the Welsh language, and then Hiab, your work as a translator. And I know that you've translated under COVID as well, and what that then means to be working with and for a community to enable their safety, which connects so much to what the two Sarahs have just been presenting, which feel very much part and parcel of each other. And whilst those gender dimensions weren't a big part of your work, Sarah, I know you, Sarah Cox, I know you reflect on it, but certainly the intergenerational dimensions were very important focus of what's happening at community level and what can be actually facilitated, which I think resonates with these sites of tension and the way tensions come up around language. We certainly see them around the use of Gaelic language and the constant stream of letters in the Scottish press about, place name signs in Gaelic, it's a waste of money, and a lot of, work around that. So I think some of these ways of understanding the role symbolically of what languages are playing and how languages can become an enabler of linguistic hospitality and those signs you were showing, Sarah, of the Welsh language, I think are really important. But maybe just as a final point, and I know we're up to time, but that in my work on conflict transformation, there's one key lesson that I would bring to these debates and tensions around multilingualism, which is that the multiple in an identity enables peacemaking. So that when you only have one identity, you're English, you're Welsh, you're an asylum seeker, you're a native, then that's all you see in someone. But when you have the multiple identities that we get in greetings rituals from around the world, when you are able to say, you are a speaker of Welsh and of English and of French, Joseph, and no doubt many others, and Hiab, you're a speaker of Bilen, and you're a speaker of Tigrinya, and you're a speaker of English, and you're a speaker of Arabic. Suddenly, as you said so beautifully, Joseph, you become a member of these communities of new language speakers. And you can actually share the very human and very humbling experiences of learning a language that Sarah was speaking of, as well as being able to be what I've called in my own work an intercultural speaker and an intercultural listener, someone who will enable people to become more enculturated in the ways that they wish to, but also who's able to become enculturated themselves by trying on another language, by trying out some different words and doing it in a way that is enabled and supported by others in a community. So I suppose those would be my summing up words for you, Gwennon, but I know that we're coming up to time. I probably need to finish at this moment. So.
Diolch yn fawr. Diolch yn fawr I chi gyd. Yn anffodus.
Yes, thank you, and thank you all. Unfortunately, we do need to officially bring this to an end. But as I mentioned, stay with us. There may be a couple of things that I would like to show you. But to finish, I'd like to thank Alison, Hiab, Sarah, and Joseph, and Sarah, the two Sarahs. I'd like to thank you all for joining, and also to everyone else. It's been a privilege to hear this discussion